first official forecast I made was, hey, guess what? We're going to have a recession. Now, the reason I called the recession back then was there were plenty of indicators to show both how out of whack the U.S. economy was in 2006, and also that important drivers of the economy, namely credit markets and housing, had already turned. In other words, the lead up to that recession was enormous before it actually tipped into an official recession beginning of 2008. And this one came completely out of left field. And that's important for a couple reasons. It's not an excuse for why we didn't call this downturn, but it gets, I think, a lot of to the heart of the matter of why we've been so optimistic relative to so many of our peers in the forecasting regime. Now, again, to give some sense of just how this came out of left field, this is one of my sort of summary slides from February of this year. And if you remember, 2019 was a year of a lot of pessimism. In fact, in January of last year, 80% of the economists who contributed to the Wall Street Journal Next Recession poll were predicting a recession by the end of 2020. And of course, the stock markets were down 20% and so on and so forth. Now, mind you, of course, no one was talking about the virus in the beginning of 2019. They were talking about inflation and interest rates and real estate collapses and Chinese trade wars and so on and so forth. By the start of this year, that number had gone from 80% down to 11% because 2019 went by, and candidly, it was a perfectly fine year. But of course, we did have some inkling that something was going on with the virus. And of course, here we are. Now, to be clear, there's really two conversations here that are intimately linked, but they are separate. One is a conversation on the disease itself, to over 20 million cases globally, 750,000 deaths. Ultimately, we expect about 200,000 deaths here in the United States by the end of the year. Context is always good. A typical year in the US, you're talking about 3 million deaths. So given some of the overlap, you're talking about a 3 to 4% increase in the death rate this year. Obviously tragic for those families who've lost loved ones, tragic for families who've had loved ones up in hospitals for weeks on end, but not as bad as some folks have been initially predicting. At the beginning of this, some of the more, shall we say, scary predictions were 1.5 to 2 million deaths in the United States. The big question, of course, is about the economy. And yet again, the numbers are truly dramatic. A combination of consumer fear and public health mandates sharply slowed economic activity. From the fourth quarter of last year to the second quarter of this year, we saw about 11% decline in real GDP. Again, context is helpful. The Great Recession saw about a 6% decline in real GDP. So this is nearly double that, although to be clear, this was over a much shorter period of time. So if you actually look at the runoff or the accumulated lost output, it's still significantly more severe under the Great Recession than where we're at currently. In July, of course, employment number came in. Unemployment right now is running about a little over 10%, so still in double digits. But where from here? Here we are in the second half of 2020, and a lot of people are wondering, where do we go in the second half of the year? What happens in 2021? And this boils down, of course, to the U or V debate. Now, I get it. There's a lot of clever is, that's a little bit of a sarcastic word, but there's all sorts of economists out there coming up with their own, I don't know, peculiar versions of these. I've seen square root signs, the K recovery, we got the Nike swooshes, we have L's and W's and everything else. Look, it boils down to a U versus V. And the U camp says this. It says that this shock to the system is so bad, it's going to take a long time for the U.S. to recover. Where those in the V camp go, no, it's not set up like that. And this thing and the economy will recover relatively quickly. Now, there are two elements to this that often get conflated. One, of course, is the path of the virus and the impact of the virus on the current performance of the economy. The second has to do with the lagging effects of the damage done to the economy during the virus closures. For example, all these people getting foreclosed on or all these households falling behind on debt. A lot of those folks in the U camp don't really clearly define which is which. Only thing they know is this is going to be really bad. And here's some selection of headlines I've grabbed because I love the hyperbole involved in these. Coronavirus will scar U.S. labor market for a decade. Worst downturn since the Great Depression. Here's one from some of my former colleagues. Make no mistake, this has morphed into a depression-type crisis. Scary numbers. Zandy from Moody's said 15 million households are at risk of losing their homes to foreclosure. Or here's another one. If we do not bring the virus under control, there will be no economic recovery. Now, if you want to put numbers to this kind of panic headlines, this is a current CBO forecast for the U.S. economy. And let me define what this is so you understand the graph. It's called the output gap. And it's the difference between what the economy could produce if nothing was wrong versus what it'll actually produce. So for example, if you go back to the Great Recession, you can see that almost 6% decline in 2008, 2009 in terms of economic output relative to what actually happened. But the really scary thing about the Great Recession was not the recession itself, but what followed afterwards. Because even though the recession ended technically in June of that year, it still took about 7.5 years for the U.S. economy to recover in as much as output got back to, basically at capacity. We got back to what we should have been able to produce. That's a long time. And of course, when you think about the Great Recession, there's no doubt that that was the worst recession since, of course, the Great Depression, which happened before World War II. Now, the CBO is predicting something very similar. They're talking about overall this year, about a 7% loss in overall economic output. And then you have about 6 years to 7 years to get back to full recovery. Very scary stuff. But then again, and this goes back to some of my ongoing messaging I've done in my presentations over the last few years, one of the things to keep in mind is when it comes to any kind of conversation about the economy, hysteria is the new normal. Again, go back to January of last year. You remember, 20% decline in the stock market, 80% of economists said we were going to have a recession driven by all this stuff. Chinese trade wars, real estate, inflation, interest rates, so on and so forth. None of that happened. And by the way, if all these headlines weren't shrieking into the expansion, they were, of course, shrieking about how bad the expansion was and how terrible the economy is doing and everything else. This miserablism, as I have defined it, has permeated every aspect of our public communications. Now, I'm not saying for a heartbeat that what we're going through right now isn't serious. Obviously, it is. The expansion's over. We've seen the worst quarter for economic growth ever in the history of the United States. However, what I would tell you is that this hysteria has simply given us a new set of hyperbolic predictions about what happens next. Look, this is not going to be a Great Recession type scenario. It's not a depression type scenario. The fact that any economist would use those terms thinking about what's going on today suggests they don't really understand what forecasting is about. Look, the Great Recession and the Great Depression were the two worst recessions in the last 150 years in the U.S. economy. Both of those recessions followed the collapse of massive financial bubbles. And that's critical to understanding what we're talking about here. When you think about what happened in the Great Recession, how bad it was, it's because of what happened before the Great Recession, during the massive financial subprime bubble, where $15 trillion of bad debt was shoved in the U.S. economy and one of the greatest financial frauds in the history of the United States. That massive amount of money caused parts of the U.S. economy to grow at levels that simply weren't sustainable. Housing was the obvious one. We all know about the crazy amount of borrowing and building and all the people who committed federal fraud by lying on their mortgage application and so on and so forth. But it wasn't just housing. In fact, it wasn't just subprime mortgage loans. It was also subprime auto loans and credit card loans. And all that money bubbling away in the housing market caused U.S. consumers to start to overspend. And prior to the Great Recession, U.S. savings rates had dropped to record low levels. When the Great Recession actually hit, of course it was going to take a very long time to recover, because in that recession, the economy was so out of whack. Millions of jobs were truly lost. You know, in 2019, we still didn't have as many construction jobs as we did in 2006. And it wasn't just the millions of construction jobs that were permanently erased from the U.S. economy. There were jobs in finance, jobs in retail, jobs in real estate. All of these jobs, when they left were gone permanently. And it took years for people to rebuild their careers, rebuild their incomes. And of course, for the rest of the economy, it took years to rebuild household balance sheets and so on and so forth. It was an extremely painful cycle. Now let's fast forward to where we are today. None of these things are in place. None of them. I mean, we entered this recession with a relatively healthy economy. We didn't enter it with an economy completely out of whack. And while I appreciate how severe the shocks to the system has been, there's no aspect of the massive restructuring that needed to take place when the Great Recession began. In fact, quite the opposite. As I've said over and over again, the U.S. economy has been on a really good track, and there was no sign of any recessions coming upon us anytime in the near future because things were in such balance. Now, again, this isn't harmless, but you have to keep in mind that the harm that will prevent a rapid recovery is harm that occurs while the economy is actually closed. So right from the get-go, we said, look, you can't use the Great Recession as a model. You just can't. That's the old cliche about the general fighting the last war. I remember prior to the Great Recession, everybody's like, oh, this isn't, even if we have a recession, it isn't going to be bad. Well, why is that? Well, the tech recession wasn't bad. Well, so what? It's a different kind of recession. And this time, everybody's saying how bad it's going to be. Why? Because the last recession was so bad. It's not the same kind of recession. Those lessons don't simply don't apply. So when we started talking about this, we immediately said this. We said, look, there's a broad range of potential outcomes here, and that's all going to depend on these 5 questions. How healthy was the economy ahead of time? How much the economy has actually been hurt? What has the government done to intervene? How long will the pandemic be among us? And will there be a major shift in post-pandemic spending patterns? When we went through these questions right from the get-go, none of these things said this is a Great Recession type scenario. What we said is this is clearly a V. The U.S. economy is going to bounce back. Now, the clearest, most distinct panic point that was out there, of course, had to do with unemployment. And I get it. The April numbers were truly startling. In April, the unemployment rate shot up to almost 15%. In 2 months, we went from 3.5% to 15% unemployment. And I appreciate why that's so startling. But again, this is not the same unemployment as we've seen in the past. It's not applicable. And right off the bat, you knew that because if you looked at the data, you realize something was fishy, something was weird, because unemployment is always a lagging indicator. The peak of unemployment during the Great Recession came in July and August of 2009 after the recession was over. It didn't lead the recession the way it did this time. And if you got a little deeper into the data, you'd start seeing why. What I've done here is I've decomposed unemployment into categories. There are people who are in temporary layoff. There are people who are new job entrants, and there are those who have actually truly lost their jobs. It's entrants and job losers that you really need to worry about, because these are folks who are going to have to get into a new place. Temporary job losers, well, haven't really lost their job. They're just waiting for their job to come back. And let me get this a little clear. This is just since the start of the year. The huge surge in unemployment was all temporary. There's everybody saying, I haven't lost my job. My job is right there, and I'll go back to it as soon as this virus thing goes away. Simple as that. Now, that temporary unemployment has been falling, but the damage occurring in the economy you can see in the number of true job losers and new entrants who can't find employment. And that number is up, but it's only a little bit above 4%. The peak during the tech recession was about 5.5%. So that's the number you want to focus on. And if you look at that number, you go, okay, we're in a recession, but it's a very mild recession at this point in time. And we have to wait, see what happens over the course of the next 4 or 5 months. And I tell you, we already got relatively good news in July, when in fact, the share of the labor force that was a job loser entrant actually didn't grow, it was flat. So again, when you break it down this way, you realize this isn't quite as scary as they were telling us. Now, how has our outlook shifted over the course of the last few months? Again, right at the beginning, we said the economy is resilient. It'll withstand this shock. It's going to bounce back. Good news also is it looks like even in the beginning of April, it looks like we moved past the peak in new cases. And we thought then, wow, as long as we have good public policy and keep this virus in control, we should be relatively back to normality by Q3. and the economy should be recovered by the end of the year. Now, by May of this year, we were both proven right and proven wrong. We were proven right in as much as those May numbers came out, and it shocked the consensus guys completely. They were talking about the loss of 6 million more jobs when we added 2 million back. They were talking about unemployment up to 19% when it actually dropped. The May surprise shocked the markets. It shocked a lot of folks. And of course, the jobs numbers were immediately backed up by some of the consumer spending numbers. Very good news. However, the first warning that our other forecasts about the virus was not coming true had to do with the fact that the number of new cases was no longer falling. Instead, it was flat. And you get to June of this year, good news, bad news. The June data was even better than May. We were already in the midst of things. Indeed, when the NBER sort of dates a recession, they go what's called peak to trough. Peak is the high point before the recession began. The peak of the Great Recession was in December of 2007. The peak this time around was in February of this year. Now, the trough is the end of the recession. That's the bottom of economic activity before recovery begins. The trough back in the Great Recession was June of 2009. But again, remember, it took 6-7 years for the U.S. economy to recover after that. This time around, it's clear. The trough of this recession, believe it or not, was April. So yes, this is the deepest recession the U.S. economy has ever suffered from. It's also going to end up being the shortest. It's a 2-month recession. It's already done. Now, recovery is the only conversation at this point in time. How fast, how long will it be to get back to normality? The bad news, of course, in June was this. Now there were new cases. The new cases of this virus were on the way up. We were in the midst of a new surge, a problem. Now, coming to July, we were all wondering, what is the new surge for the economy? Was it going to flatten the recovery, or was it going to create a W? Remember the old W, which is down, up, down, up? Actually, we had an enormous surge of new cases in June and July of this year, and it didn't have anywhere near the impact it had the first time around. In fact, I got to tell you, for all the number of new cases, it's remarkable how well the U.S. economy actually did. The only thing that happened was recovery stalled a bit. It didn't actually reverse course at all. So a completely different kind of situation. Silver lining number 2, guess what? The surge in new cases is already coming to an end, and we're yet again getting control of the virus. So while we're still fighting things and we're not back to recovery, from my perspective, the V is still clearly in place. It's just a little wider than it was before. So let's get a little bit into the numbers here so you have a better sense of what I'm talking about. As already noted, that GDP number in Q2 was truly startling, negative 33%, roughly what economists were talking about. Most of that was in consumer spending, not too much of a surprise, but obviously a bit of a pullback in business investment. Trade and government was weak. That's all you can say about it. Getting a little bit more in the consumer spending, take a look on the right-hand side, and this is the breakdown. Now, some of the things in there are obvious. Food service, accommodations, restaurants, and hotels are doing terrible. Recreation, Hollywood, most music venues, Hollywood Bowl, whatever, are closed. We know, obviously, amusement parks are not open for the most part. Transportation, airlines are still doing terrible. But interestingly enough, the part of consumer spending that hit worse than anything else was healthcare. Now, that bizarre circumstance, of course, was driven by the fact that, after all, healthcare is where there's a lot of human contact intervention, and the contagiousness of the disease worried, understandably, a lot of healthcare providers. And they said, look, we either need to shut down or at least eliminate all non-essential procedures, which is exactly what they did. Here's the good news. Healthcare is not cyclical. It's not. If you won't go back during the Great Recession, there wasn't one quarter where healthcare spending actually declined. Not one. It goes up. And that's because most healthcare is not funded directly by household budgets, but of course by various sorts of insurance programs, public or private. Anything that wasn't done in the second quarter will get done in the second half of the year. Simple as that. And that's going yet again to be another element that supports the idea that this is going to be a V-shaped recovery. Just as simple as that. Now, food service, accommodation, recreation, obviously those are on the front line, and they are clearly going to lag the recovery overall, but other things are moving up. Here's another way of looking at the recession already being over. This is this is a GDP, a monthly GDP number. This is Goldman Sachs, although a few providers of this. And again, you can see when you say, well, where was the truly ugliest month? It was April. That was the bottom. And interestingly enough, June was an enormous recovery for where we were in April. Now, you think towards the third quarter of this year. If you imagine nothing happened in the third quarter of the year, that is to say, no more additional growth in economic activity, it stayed the same as it was in June, you are already lined up for a 20% growth rate in the third quarter. By the way, that's consensus, which I don't understand. Are they truly predicting that July, August, and September are going to look exactly like June? Again, that is a very dismal forecast, and candidly doesn't stand up in light of any of the very short-run data we're getting. We're already really strongly bouncing back. We really are. Here's some numbers. Auto and light truck sales through July got back to almost 15 million. Now again, we're not back all the way, but look how rapidly we're coming back to say what happened in the Great Recession. The Great Recession dip and comeback occurred over, I don't know, about a 6-year period. We're not even 6 months and we're mostly recovered. Retail sales up to June. Again, a big bounce back. I'm really looking forward to the July numbers that are come out Friday of this week. I expect they're going to, again, surprise a lot of folks. Now, when you think about retail sales, some sectors are recovering faster than others. This is great data. For any of you who haven't seen it, there's another one of these billionaire-funded sort of economic research centers. It's called Opportunity Insights. And that guy has used a lot of his budget to go out and buy some really cool credit card data. And bless his soul, he's making that data available. I suggest you all go to Opportunity Insights. They literally have daily and weekly credit card numbers. You can see this data is actually coming into the beginning of August. And you can see the massive downturn in spending. In this case, I'm breaking out healthcare, restaurants, and transportation. And then you can see the recovery. Healthcare is only 10% below where it was at the beginning of this thing. Restaurants about 30%. Transportation, again, is the big thing. That's airlines, down about 50%. And of course, you look into August of this year, again, continue to move. The housing markets have already bounced back. I can't believe all the predictions of housing collapses and millions of people being foreclosed on. Some of the big real estate data providers continue to forecast prices going down. Now, I got to tell you, when you say the word home prices are going to fall, that's a big prediction. That's happened twice in the last 60 years in the U.S. The nominal home prices have fallen. Home prices are really, really sticky, and they just don't fall. It takes a lot to get home prices to fall. Why would you say that? And then, of course, guess what happened in June? Markets bouncing back. Prices are up. Existing home sales are up. New home sales are up. Housing looks great. But nevertheless, don't let that get the miserables down. CoreLogic, while acknowledging that home prices went up in June, said, well, we expect they're going to go down in July. I don't know why you would say that. I just don't. Now, there are lagging indicators. Employment's gotten back to about 140 million in the U.S. It started this at about 152 million. We got a long ways to go. But remember, employment is a lagging indicator. It's getting back there. Production, same sort of thing. Remember, with the bounce back in consumer spending, that's eventually going to ricochet through inventories and eventually push industrial production up. So things are moving the right direction, but this part of the economy is lagging just a little bit. Will the economy stall? Will the recovery stall? What about the second half of the year? Aren't people falling behind and everything else? Well, this brings me, of course, into current ferocious debate over the second stimulus package coming from the federal government. I'm appalled. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, the federal government had to do something. But, you know, what they did already was so overwhelming that it's plenty. In fact, if I had to sit down and I said, what do you think we should do for the next 6 weeks? My answer would be extend unemployment benefits, nothing else. Nothing else. Because right now they've already done so much. And remember, they're kind of pushing on a string. The reason that you're not seeing the economy bounce back ferociously from this $3 trillion package is largely because people can't spend. You know, giving people money to spend when the problem is they can't spend, ultimately that doesn't really accomplish a whole bunch to get the overall economy stimulated. Um, Now, again, some of the things they did were fine. A lot of it looked more like election year politics than anything else. But there's no doubt that the federal government has got involved in a very, very big way. And this is probably the graph I can tell you that gives me the most optimism for the second half of the year. Personal income's on the left-hand side. Personal income's 85% of the economy. It's basically income going to people through either wages from your employer, your income if you're a sole proprietorship, and some other income like interest payments or rental payments, things like that. The economy is about a little over 22 trillion. This is in the first quarter of this year, it was about 19 trillion. Look what happened to personal income from Q1 to Q2. It didn't fall. It went up. It went up sharply. Now, it wasn't because incomes went up. If you look at compensation of employees and proprietor incomes, they fell, from the fourth quarter of last year, the first quarter of this year, about $1 trillion or so. $1 trillion. Big number, big loss. But the government, which typically puts about $3 trillion back into the economy for various sorts of social benefits, this time around put in 5.6. In other words, from the fourth quarter to the second quarter of this year, from an income perspective, we saw $1 trillion of lost income, but the federal government put 2.5 trillion back in. 1 trillion lost income. For every dollar of lost income, the federal government has already put $2.50 in. Now, the problem is people can't spend the money. Spending is still down. So where's all that money going? Well, it's going into savings. Look at these numbers. Savings in the second quarter of the year were $4.7 trillion. That's $3 trillion higher than the first quarter. $3 trillion. Where's that money going? Look on the right-hand side. This is commercial bank deposits in the U.S. Prior to this mess, about 13.2 trillion. Right now, 15.7 trillion. There is $2.5 trillion sitting in bank accounts waiting to be spent. 2.5 trillion. This is massive amounts of dry powder. Only thing you need to do, only thing, is get the virus under control. This money's going to come out like nobody's business, and it's going to get this economy up and running. This is rocket fuel. You just need to get the virus under control. Simple as that. We don't need another stimulus package, except for, of course, like I said, those unemployment benefits. And by the way, who's behind? Well, this is data on Opportunity Insights, again, breaking down low versus high income. High income people are down in terms of their spending vastly more than low income families. And this, of course, gets back to the fact that a lot of this is simply discretionary spending. You're talking about a circumstance in which, again, high income people still making money, have lots of money in the bank, and they're just waiting for the opportunity to spend it. That will get the economy going, just get the virus under control. In fact, from my perspective, my biggest worry, something that no one is talking about. We started this year with the federal government in the midst of an 11-year expansion in one of the healthiest economies we've seen in 30 years. They were already lined up to borrow $1 trillion. $1 trillion in the face of a growing fiscal crisis driven by Social Security, Medicare, and retiring baby boomers. We had, at the beginning of this year, $50,000 in debt for every man, woman, child in the United States. Because of the $4 trillion they're not going to have to borrow this year. $4 trillion, you can add $12,000 more for every man, woman, and child. And by the way, they want to borrow $1 to $3 trillion more. What are you doing? Stop. Stop. Enough. This is not free money. I'm amazed that we are willing to leave our children $7 trillion in debt because of the circumstances we're in right now. It's unconscionable. And yet, we don't seem to care. The long run has been forgotten. And the numbers are startling. In June of this year, they borrowed more money, the federal government borrowed more money than they did all of 2019. Now, for those of you thinking about getting out there and taking advantage of these low interest rates and refining, you better do it now. In a typical year in the United States, there's about $3 trillion of new debt generated. This year, all by itself, the federal government is lined up for $4 trillion plus. I really don't know what this is going to do to the credit markets at the end of the year, particularly when people start spending again. We are lining up for a potential surge in interest rates. Be prepared and take advantage while you can. Now, what about this new surge? Again, the first time around, again, it's hard. You can't compare April to where we were in July because in July there was a lot more testing. But we know that there were a lot of cases, at least as bad as April. It wasn't a second wave. People who talk about second waves, you're talking about the virus re-entering places it's already been. We don't really have a second wave. This was a second surge. It got into places it hadn't been before. But intriguingly, the U.S. economy didn't collapse this time. In fact, quite the opposite. It's amazing how well we muddled through the second surge. And even more importantly, the second surge needs to be done. So now it looks like Q4 is when we get back to opening. So here's some of the new data. Again, this is a 7-day rolling average of new cases per million. You can see the last time around we got to about 100 cases per million. That's, again, not comparable because we had a lot less testing. This time we're about to about 200. We're already down to about 160. Death, here's on a state-by-state basis. Again, you can see the major states that saw the second surge, Florida, Texas, Arizona, all falling pretty dramatically, despite, I should point out, not really having very, very heavy-duty government intervention in the economy. I, over the weekend, happened to be in Arizona, was pretty stunned. They didn't even close their restaurants. You could actually eat inside in Arizona, despite this. And by the way, the number of new cases is coming down. And what you're finding more and more is this entire episode is less, if you will, about government mandates and more about personal behavior. Take a look at Japan. Take a look at Sweden. Many fewer cases than we have right now. And overall, by the way, neither one of those economies closed. It just didn't. This is really about personal behavior. It's not about government mandates. I'm not going to worry too much about this. Here's the California numbers a little bit closer so you can see what's going on here. Again, you can see the sharp decline in number of cases. Very, very good news. Decline in the number of hospitalizations. And overall new tests relatively flat. We're kind of over the hump on this. As simple as that.
So we should, Chris, right quick, Chris, we should probably wrap up.
I'm sorry. I'm talking
questions just in the next couple minutes.
Oh, sure. My apologies for going too a little long here. Here's the key. No new recession for all these new cases. Look what happened the first time around with the massive collapse in consumer spending. This time around, no collapse whatsoever. So, again, we're doing really well. California, very similar sort of picture. So, for me, this is not about government intervention. It's about people doing the right thing, about protecting those at risk and wearing your mask. What's amazing to me, go back to the conversation about miserabilism and the extreme politicization of everything that goes on in this economy right now. I'm amazed that wearing a mask has become part of the culture war. And yet, if you wear a proper mask, it's probably one of the best ways of getting control of this virus. And yet here we are doing all the wrong things. So, look, the situation is bad, but it's not that bad. The V is the only logical outcome. These folks telling you it's going to take years to recover from this, that doesn't make any sense. If you were a profitable business in December of last year, there's no reason you shouldn't be a profitable business in December of this year. Now, our perspective, 26 to 27% growth in Q3, record up, probably 8% in Q4. Unemployment will be below 7% by the end of the year. There'll be tiny moderate upticks in debt distress. No impact on real estate. That's a long-run asset. This is not a long-run situation. I appreciate there are wild cards. There could be a true second round. Global situation is obviously tenuous. We know retail and restaurants are going to lag because there were too many restaurants and too much retail prior to this. But for the most part, we're getting out of this and we're getting out of it relatively well. The true enemy, of course, yet again, has to do with the preposterous nature of any kind of discussion over the U.S. economy. Yet again, politicization, polarization, miserabilism has pushed us to enact more bad policy, thus not actually helping the situation, perhaps even making it worse. We need to step back from this crazy hyperbolic conversations we have about the economy, acknowledge what we need to work on, and figure out ways of compromising to come up with those solutions. And of course, at the same time, appreciate that, again, these things aren't as bad as they're telling us. We're over the hump. We're moving the right direction. Wear your mask. We're going to be fine. And I'll wrap up there. Apologies for talking a little long.
Dr. Thornburg, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for actually that really enlightening analysis from an expert like yourself. I know we are running short on time, but let me just turn it over to Paul Thomas, who, if you have a question for Dr. Thornburg, let's just maybe take 2 questions from the public,
Paul?
if you want to put it into the chat.
Oh.
And
we actually do have.
If you would please do so. We do have one, and Brian Bocock, I completely agree with you. Let me turn it over to you, Brian, or Paul.
My assistant economist is here to help with the Q&A session.
Okay, that's where the real brains are at, I see.
A couple comments
question,
from
Peter.
Brian Bocock, who said, Dr. Thornburg, your talk today gave me some relief. The knot in my stomach has some relief. I really enjoyed this, and thank you for the light at the end of the tunnel. And he says that he's going to take this info to the water board in our first meeting. I suppose it's not a question, it's just a compliment.
Paul, I'd like to ask a question, if I may, really quick.
Sure.
First and foremost, thank you for being so frank and sincere and removing the veil on this hysteria culture. 2 questions really quick. You know that there's a lot of savings, so what are your thoughts? My concern is inflation after that. 2, here in California, we've got some real bad problems on a state level with EDD, people not getting their unemployment because your recommendation is just doing more unemployment. But how is that going to impact here in California versus the national economy when we can't get that EDD money, unemployment money to people? And our concern is how is that going to impact our municipalities?
Both good questions. The inflation thing is intriguing. I'll agree with you on that. Because obviously the Federal Reserve has opened up the spigots. They have to right now. When you think of all that money sitting in checking accounts, monetary velocity has collapsed. That's deflationary. You got to rebalance that by adding more money. Now, the question is again, think towards the Great Recession. They left that money in for a long time because it was a very long recovery. This time is going to be, at least in our estimation, a fairly short recovery, and that's going to see a lot of monetary expansion. They're going to have to back off quick. If they don't, the potential for inflation is absolutely there. But again, it's a policy choice on the basis of the Fed. You have to watch what they do. Will they reverse course fast enough? Now, to be clear, it takes a couple of years for inflation to creep into the system. So if there are inflation risks, you got plenty of time to jig before it jags, if you will. So just hold on and wait to see what the Fed does before you panic about inflation. Could happen. There's no doubt about it. I would argue right now inflation risk is the highest it's ever been. Your second question about unemployment and the EDD, well, let's be a little cautious because it's not like anybody's not getting it. I get it. They're kind of screwed up. They kind of messed up here and there. But actually, for all the finger pointing, most people in California have indeed gotten their unemployment checks. Yes, some haven't, but most have. And given how old and cruddy the system is, I think they've done a pretty good job. The real question is, why are we in 2020 still using systems built in the 1980s? It's amazing to me that we don't seem to have a government that can actually invest appropriately. And of course, when you get into it, you realize that the bureaucracy, which is not typically good at this kind of stuff anyway, nowadays, it's just paralyzed. And again, a lot of that, I think, gets into just the heart of politics and how the government operates and how, at some level, we don't actually enforce basic standards of performance on our government because we don't pay attention to that. We're all too busy screaming at the other party and telling them how evil they are. No, government's for everybody, and the politicians need to work for everybody. And this idea that we're deep into these two incredibly polarized camps, well, that's why things don't get done in government. We have to learn how to send responsible, centrist people who can find compromise and make solutions to government, whether that's Sacramento or Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Dr. Thornburg. With that, we're going to have to wrap it up. We have about a half hour left of our board meeting, so we'd like to extend our appreciation to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Goodbye.
Bill, excellent recommendation to have Dr. Thornburg.